joining today's webinar. As Maya mentioned, this is the second webinar in a 3-webinar series that's designed to provide some insights into what's different or what's the same with respect to applying resilience measurement principles at an activity level. So much of the resilience measurement work has been done in the context of impact evaluations, looking at the collective impact of multiple activities or multiple projects. And so we were getting the question quite frequently around, what's in the manageable interest of one implementing partner or one activity or one set of activities. How do you capture whether or not you're strengthening resilience from the implementing partner perspective as opposed to kind of a constellation of multiple activities. And so this guidance note, which I hope everyone will download and read if you haven't done so already, is designed to speak to that question, that demand around kind of what's in the manageable interest of the implementing partner and then what's so different. We also designed the guidance note to clear up myths. So one myth is that everything is completely and utterly different when you're applying resilience measurement principles to M&E, and you'll learn through this webinar that that's not necessarily the case, and that applying resilience measurement principles has to be completely onerous. And so hopefully you'll also come away from this webinar feeling like that's also a myth that's been cleared up. The speakers today will talk about kind of 2 big buckets of difference, namely the role that risk plays in M&E and the role of resilience capacities and responses. And then they'll shed some light through examples via 2 case studies. So I'm hoping that this is a really rich set of presentations and discussion with all of you. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Diana Picon, who's an M&E consultant and one of the lead writers on this guidance note. So thank you to Diana for your upcoming presentation and for drafting this, and to the team of writers who really brought this guidance note to fruition. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany. Everyone, good morning. I know you have all read the guidance note already, of course, but I do want to try to condense the information that we have in those pages. There's quite a bit of it into a few slides before giving the information to, thank you, to Jill and Sonia, who will then talk about some practical examples. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, I think, with the presentation. So the first question that we wanted to talk about, as Tiffany had discussed, was how would we move forward with resilience M&E at the project or activity level? And that came from several questions that we kept getting from Mercy Corps staff in the field. We were asked questions about how were outcome and impact indicators adequate to capture whether resilience is built. How can we integrate resilience measurement? Not only how, but also when and what do we measure? And what will it tell us for our M&E plans and to be able to inform activities? What should we measure in the absence of a shock or stress? Because many projects have a limited duration and may not experience a shock or stress in their lifetime. And how do we right-size resilience measurement? Again, as short projects or limited budgets or other constraints or complexities such as multiple partners or multiple sectors are intertwined in our activities, what is possible for us in the field to do to monitor and to evaluate? One of the things that we assumed was that evaluations, higher level well-being outcome evaluations, were going to be usually done externally. So we really wanted to focus on what implementing partners could do during a limited time activity. And we wanted to focus on three main aspects: the integration of resilience measurement into activity M&E plans based on their size, scope, and complexity. We wanted to understand when and what to monitor and evaluate for resilience programming in the context of a shock or stress and in the absence of a shock or stress. And then have a quick look on what tools have been used, how have they been adapted, what were their pros and cons based on the experience that certain Mercy Corps projects had in the field. And then we couldn't really cover it all, right? It's only a 20-page guidance note. So we really couldn't go into how do you choose the activities based on M&E information that tells us what builds resilience or not. And we couldn't really go into evaluating tools about whether they were good for different activities in terms of complexity, size, and budget. So we will focus on those three top sections in this presentation and in the guidance note. But before we even did that, we really needed to come up with some principles. And we decided that going back and forth on what makes resilience measurements so different was that one of the first few things that we needed to do was to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, resilience. And resilience projects tend to sometimes have resilience in the title, but not necessarily resilience in the content. Is that really one of the objectives or one of the things that we aim to achieve with a project or an activity? So meeting those standards is important before you even begin this journey of adding on to resilience or integrating resilience into an M&E plan. Literature reviews and assessments, they need to have a focus on shocks and stresses in order to prepare you to draft and integrate a resilience M&E plan. A resilience theory of change must be developed, as well as having M&E staff trained or exposed to the basic resilience concepts. There needs to be kind of a common language. Whether different, if you have a complex program with different implementers that have different ideas of what resilience is, or different concepts and definitions, those need to be somehow brought into one that can then lead you to monitor and evaluate those concepts. And then finally, in terms of what needs to be understood based on requirements and internal M&E capacity and expectations of what you can do within your limitations of size, budget, and complexity. And now we get into what is so different. And we decided that, at least based on our experience, the basics had to be there. We needed to have a deep understanding of the theories of change and other frameworks within that activity. Make sure that we already had a capable M&E system with sufficient staff that is, again, has been trained at least in the basic concepts, but also in some, not only of resilience, but also in M&E in general. And that an M&E plan that guides staff in defining a results chain and indicators. Now, this M&E plan then would have these add-ons that we call them add-ons for resilience. And they would really focus on resilience capacities, the shocks or stresses expected based on those assessments that would have happened at the beginning, and the set of responses we expect that would result from the use of the resilience capacities given a shock or stress. And some objective measures for those measures, subjective and subjective measures for those shocks and stresses, and their monitoring, as well as some questions that would let us know whether we are really reaching those capacities and the responses that we aimed to influence. Oh, yes, it's time for a poll. Shall we then go ahead and show it? Sorry. Okay, here we go. So if you can all please let us know, what do you think? Which of the following basics do you have covered for resilience in your project? And we've given you a few options here. There's assessments that include shocks and stresses, resilience theory of change, M&E staff that have been training resilience concepts, resilience measurement requirements and expectations are understood by staff and leadership, all of the above, none of the above, and you can also check several of those options too. So you guys are responding to the poll, and we will end it in a little bit. I wanted to show you a graph that we came up with based on results chains. So you've done your theory of change, and now you're coming up with what it is that you are actually going to focus on in this activity or project. You have your typical results framework. So we wanted to show what a typical one would look like. Regardless of donor, sometimes the wording depends largely on that. But you have usually a set of inputs and outputs, a sub-purpose or sub-intermediate result. Then you have kind of an intermediate result or a purpose, and then finally your goal or development objective. And this is obviously simplifying. There are various variations of this typical results framework. And what we said was, well, let's see how a results framework for a resilience-focused project would look like. And really the main difference is in those the second and third step. And instead of basically having these sub-intermediate results, there is a focus on resilience capacities and the responses to shocks and stresses. And the main idea of the guidance note is to kind of walk you step by step on how to come up with those resilience capacities and responses to shocks and stresses based on result statements and thinking through what it is that you expect to achieve with your interventions and outputs. The intermediate outcomes and well-being outcomes will also have a similar methodology, but we really try to focus on those resilience capacities or responses because this is really what makes it so different at the activity level, especially when you're planning your M&E. I will let actually my colleague Jill Scantian talk more about this in specific examples during her presentation. I think we could end that poll right now and tell you kind of what happened. So it does seem like quite a few of you feel like you have the assessments include shocks and stresses, and some of you, about 30%, have the resilience theory of change down. But much fewer people have, thank you, M&E staff trained in resilience concepts. And this is interesting, it's good. It's something that we probably should all improve on, and the resilience measurement requirement and expectations are understood by staff and leadership. Yes. A food for thought and things that we can continue to discuss during our breakout rooms later on today. I will continue then to go through one of the examples that we talked about in the guidance note, and this is about the resilience log frames. We have when we were looking at how we designed our log frames, and we'll take a look at it in a minute, we said that we should look at three main things. One is the impact framework, part of the log frame, which will discuss the well-being outcomes, the intermediate outcomes, the resilience responses and resilience capacities of the project. And then have two different sheets, two separate sheets, if you will. One that works on or discusses shocks and stress monitoring with what indicators and variables such as severity and exposure to look at when monitoring shocks and stresses. And a third one on output, and basically that would be your regular process, day-to-day activity data and output monitoring. For the purposes of time, we're only going to be looking at the impact framework, resilience responses and resilience capacities, and the shock and stress monitoring table. And here's the example that I wanted to to show from the guidance note. And it focuses on the capacities and responses. As you can see, you have clearly defined response and capacity on the left side column. And I'm taking an example based on experience from Mercy Corps in Pahal, a project, I believe, or in Southeast Asia, and adapted it for the purposes of the guidance note. And it looks particularly at the capacity to access financial services for farmers. And the capacity here is that farmers have access to financial services, including loans, savings, and insurance. And the response being when there's a shock or stress, farmers use financial services continuously post-shock stress. The indicators that you see, we have a regular indicator column. The regular indicator is something that you would see very often in USAID or other donors' M&E requirements. The number of farmers benefiting from financial services, or the number of financial service providers that have been supported or that are serving poor households. So for these indicators, while they're very important in order to report to the donor, we still want to learn more about what makes that household or that financial service provider resilient to a shock or stress. And so we came up with a series of capacity questions, things that could tell us pre-shock or in the absence of a shock or stress, what could tell us that these farmers could be prepared for a shock or stress. So we go from basic questions, such as do farmers save for emergencies, to perhaps more advanced ones, like do farmers report self-efficacy in financial management. In terms of the financial service providers, a more basic question could be were barriers to access clients to prepare for shock stresses, were they an issue for providers or is still an issue for providers? And a more advanced question could be, do providers offer products in preparation to particular shock? Or are providers promoting products with the farmers who need them? And the response questions, taking a look at post-shock or stress. We could be looking also at basic questions for the farmer side, as did farmers use their savings according to their plan, according to how they expected to do so following a shock or stress? Two more advanced ones about were farmers able to claim insurance benefits and were they satisfied with the insurer's response. And it all depends, obviously, on where you are with your activity and where you are in the system, if more basic questions are required or more advanced ones. For the financial intermediaries or financial service providers, a more basic question could be, are providers still accessible to affected farmers during and post-shock stress? One of the things that I want to talk about here is that we did want to have a few things included. We wanted to make sure that all levels were included, the household, the community, and the system in terms of questions. And also the types of capacities. Are we talking about absorptive, adaptive, and transformative? And while we don't necessarily need to be monitoring capacities at that level, or at least we thought that it wasn't necessarily that important, it was important to make sure that we had a combination of those in our log frame. And then finally, we want to look at the table on shock and stress monitoring. And here are the variables for example of drought and land degradation are exposure and severity, with indicators that are subjective, like the experience that people or that farmers and households are going through, with a mix of objective indicators such as soil fertility, farms with reduced soil erosion, etc. And I'm not going to go through the tool table that we have in the guidance note. It's quite extensive, but I do want you guys to take a look at it. It is important to understand that we wanted to have a balance between quantitative and qualitative, a balance in between types of measurement. Some of them are very much measurement specific, other ones are more learning focused. And what we do want is a living list and to continue updating it as a community. As you guys start testing tools or adapting tools, if you can give us feedback and so that we can integrate that learning into this table and keep it alive so that everybody can learn from it, we really would encourage that. Thank you. I think we have time. Maybe, I don't know if we have time for a quick Q&A, but I'll
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And we do have time for just a very quick Q&A. We do have 3 questions that have come up in the chat box. One of them we'll save for the final Q&A session on long-term impact evaluations. And so I'll pose the first 2 to Diana now. The first one is the resilience theory of change constant or varies with vulnerability being addressed? And the second one is a semantic question. I'm confused on the interchangeable usage of project/activity. Are the recommendations presented today for both?
Thank you. Yeah, so interchangeable, yes. I'm sorry for the confusion. So for USAID purposes, because this guidance note was done under the USAID auspices, we focused on activities, which are basically more or less projects in normal everyday vernacular. For the first question, so yeah, theories of change. I mean, they could change obviously with different things, and one of the things that we were discussing even internally is how often or how frequent should theories of change change. And I think we do have a breakout room later on that we'll talk about that, and actually we want to also hear from you and your experiences. They may change based on changes. Maybe shocks and stresses change also even during the time of your activity. There may just be, you know, you're worried about floods one day, but maybe a couple of years into your project, the next shock or stress comes to be about conflict, and then your theory of change will change. So I will leave it there because we will need to talk more about it during our breakout rooms, and I think that will be a time where we can also start from.
Great, thank you, Diana. And without further ado, we're going to move right along to the next.
The guidance note number 5. I'm going to take us through step by step how to build those results chains, and then dig into some case studies around, you know, what were some of the challenges and solutions that we faced within Mercy Corps when we were trying to integrate resilience measurement into the program or project design. So quite often teams, you know, when I suggest let's build a results chain as the first step of their resilience program or project design, they really ask me, you know, what is a results chain, A, and then what value does it add? Why do I need it? I have a theory of change. And so usually what I find with the teams that I'm working at is that they have a general sense of the activities or the interventions that they're going to do, but they don't really know how that's going to build resilience. And so the result chain exercise is really designed to allow the teams to walk through step by step in a logical order of how exactly their activities or interventions are going to contribute to building resilience. They also identify sometimes gaps in the theory of change or synergies between those different program intervention areas. And then lastly, you know, it really builds that buy-in and common understanding of resilience and what your resilience approach is at the beginning of the program. And so now we're going to go through kind of step by step, how do we build them? So the first thing we usually do is sort of start with what we know. And so typically in the beginning of the program, because it's already in the proposal, you'll know generally what you're going to do. So you have your technical sectors or your integrated program approach, or maybe you have even a work plan already. And so you'll have that. And then you also might know what your higher level development goals that you're trying to achieve are, because those are usually in the proposal. And so now the trick is really to just sort of fill in the middle. And so the next step is identifying what that primary shock or stress or primary shocks or stresses that the program or project will try to achieve. typically multiple contexts, or the context we work in, there's many, many different shocks or stresses, but I'd really try to have teams sort of focus in on what are the ones that your project or program is really trying to address. And so then the next step is to identify, well, what are those resources and strategies you're going to try to build so that communities and households can respond or cope with that shock or stress. Now, these are typically in the resilience jargon known as capacities, but when I'm working with teams, I try to just kind of reduce the jargon and just say resources are the things that you have and strategies are the things that you do. And these are the things you're trying to build. And so if those things are in place, the next step would be then to ask yourself, well, how do you expect people to actually use those capacities or those resources and strategies to respond to a shock or stress? So that's the next layer in your result chain there. And then typically resilience programs, you're either trying to build capacities to address the actual drivers of that shock or stress, or you're trying to build them so that people can cope with the effects of that shock or stress. So I'll give you an example. Maybe it's a flood resilience program where you have some disaster risk reduction activities trying to build an early warning system. So that would be a resource. And so when that flood hits, you would expect the communities to be able to spring into action and to save lives and property. Or maybe your program is also trying to improve land and water management strategies, which would be a strategy to reduce flooding through improving or reducing erosion. So that would be addressing some of the drivers of that shock or stress. And so those outcomes or those results would be seen at that intermediate outcome level, which would then contribute to your overall program or development goals at the top. And so these are really just, the layers that we see. There's probably you can have more or less, but these are the basic ones that we see when we're building result chains. All right, so the next step is that we then map our activities or our interventions to the result chain so we can see how we're actually contributing. And at this point, I often find that we also need to do a bit of redesign or at least integrate our activities. Because as you all know, resilience programs, they tend to have multiple sectors because they're sort of getting at that systems level change. But a lot of times activities or interventions are siloed by sector. And that really increases the time burden on communities and leads to inefficiencies in the program implementation. So we really encourage teams to either integrate based on location. So maybe you have a common actor or partner where multiple interventions or activities can occur. Or maybe you'll actually redesign it so that you can actually embed multiple different activities within one. And I'll go into an example of that a little bit later. All right, so we've seen this before, this slide here, and the next step in a result chain is actually then to either map your results to your existing result framework. So if you have a rigid framework where you're not able to change it, well, the best you can really do is just to map those results back to that existing log frame. But if you have a more flexible results framework, I would then encourage you to actually just reorganize it a bit to include those middle parts or those the parts that make the results framework special for resilience programs. That's the adding in a section for resilience capacities and responses to shocks and stresses. And then also to note that you'd also need to monitor for those shocks and stresses. And actually, Brad Zagara is going to be presenting on this in the next week's short course. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so it is time for a poll again. And all right, so I would like to know from your experience, have you used results chains in your project or program? We have a couple options ranging from having never used them to using them only in the beginning in the design phase, using them to adapt program implementation, and using them for program design, implementation, and impact evaluation, so all throughout the process. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds here to fill that out. All right, so I'm seeing some responses rolling in. Looks like the most common is having never used them, which I think is what my experience was in Mercy Corps before I worked with teams on these. We also have about, well, surprisingly and great, look, we're seeing about a third of people are also responding that they've used them throughout the entire process. So it looks like we have people with experience in both ends of that spectrum, which is great. All right. Perfect. I think maybe we'll close the poll. That's all right. All righty. So now we're going to dig into some case studies of my experience implementing these different resilience measurement in the design and planning stage of programs. So the first one we're going to talk about is building results chains in a livestock program in Mongolia. And so, this project had 7 different technical intervention areas, which was quite a few. And so in the beginning, after we'd done our resilience assessment, we weren't quite sure exactly how, working through these different market actors, how are we actually going to build resilience? And so we sat down with the entire program team, from the frontline staff up through the country director, and we built 7 different results chains. And also a program level results chains that showed the synergies between the different intervention areas. And as you can see, they're fairly detailed. We had a lot of different boxes here. We also identified key performance results, which are the changes that would actually signify significant movement in the program. And we listed our market actors and what we would expect to see following the same layers up through, from the activity up through the outcome level. Now, after we did this, some challenges did arise after this exercise. So, we weren't entirely clear on how the program sectors were going to work together to build resilience. So we built the results chain separately because there was those 7 different technical areas, but, we found that they weren't really integrating well in the actual practice. We also found that although the results chains were developed in the beginning and everyone was really excited, that excitement kind of waned or decreased over time, and we weren't really revisiting them. We also didn't really have a clear plan of how we were going to evaluate how those results were going to be, or how we would know the results were achieved. And so we came up with a solution where we embedded these results chains reviews that we conducted. We've already done one, but the plan is to conduct them every 6 months at minimum. And so really what these do is that we review the current activities. So what have we done? We then, using the program or project evidence, we reflect back on our results to say, have we achieved them given the evidence we're seeing? What gaps are we seeing in data? So what don't we know? Or program implementation, and what are the key actions we should take? And through this first result chain review, we identified some areas that were tricky for our program that we wanted to work on. So again, thinking through how we can integrate the activities, how can we lead to a market systems change, because that was the focus of the project, and then how can our activities or approach be sustainable, and how can we scale? We found this exercise extremely useful. And so we're actually revisiting the results now, trying to get them a little more integrated to show, how the enabling environment or the market systems change. So the, all of the different technical sectors are at that level. How does that actually build resilience for individual herders so that they can withstand the harsh winters and livestock disease, and so they can achieve well-being? And so that's still to come, but I think that it definitely improved through this result chain review. All right, so the second case study is going to be on how we integrated activities. And so this is going to be quickly talking about a program called Managing Risk Through Economic Development. And so this program was really designed in the beginning to have integration. And so a lot of the approach was, how do we give financial incentives for disaster risk reduction. And so a lot of the program activities and the approach was integrated from the beginning. However, we did find that in the first phase of the project, there was significant gaps in achievement of results by the participants' gender. And as we developed the results chains, we had a lot of boxes and things around, well, we're going to change gender norms and behaviors and practices, but we didn't actually have those, we didn't really address those in the activities. We didn't really have an approach for how we were going to do that. Another challenge was, again, the time burden of too many activities on our participants. And so what we did was that we actually combined a household dialogue session to promote joint decision-making in households. We integrated that directly into our financial literacy model. And so what could have been two activities, we actually combined those into one to address those gender norms. We also found that a lot of our activities like agriculture, improved agriculture practices, early warning system information, et cetera, were all kind of through one market actor, which was the agriculture extension worker. And so we tried to have all those activities happen around this one actor so that the communities weren't overburdened, which was really helpful. All right, our final case study here is through log frame alignment. So, you know, as you may have experienced, the typical measurement framework, and as Deanna pointed out, it's not really aligned with a resilience framework. And so this provides quite a challenge when you're trying to then map your results back to it. Although a lot of times indicators are decided before the results chain exercise, and maybe they can't change. And then, you know, if you're going to measure all those anticipated results in your results chains, there's going to be way too many indicators. And so this is just an example, again, going back to the Mongolia program, of what their log frame looked like before our results chain exercise. What you'll notice is that the indicators are, you know, they're the typical indicators that you might measure in a project or program, but they don't really tell us how we're building resilience. It's not really clear here. Although the goal is to, you know, build resilience there. You'll also see that there's an assumptions column, which is typical, but you'll see that, you know, there's no economic crisis or favorable climate conditions. It's really, you know, those are the shocks and stresses that we expect to actually happen. So those shouldn't really be in the assumptions column. They should actually be, you know, we should expect that those are going to happen in the program, and then our activities and our results should reflect that. And so what we did, because it was a more flexible program where we could actually change our result framework, we added, as Deanna pointed out, you know, we added the result chain result column there right next to the indicator. So it was really clear how our indicators were actually measuring resilience. We also, you know, streamlined the means of verification section so you could see how the different measurement activities overlap, and so you can see, you know, how much you're going to have, how much effort you're going to have to really put into measuring these different things. And then so what you can do is that you can keep your indicator numbering the same in your indicator column, and just so you can see how it maps back to your result chain and how, you know, and how that then links back to your goals and outcomes or objectives. All right, so I know that was really quick, so I have my email here in case any questions arise, but I think we might definitely have time at the end of the presentation to address questions. And so now I am going to pass the baton over to you.
Thanks so much, Jill, and thank you everyone for joining today. Jill did a great job talking to us about some specific examples where we can integrate resilience measurement through the results chain process. And I wanted to present a broader perspective of some of the opportunities on larger programs and some of the challenges of integrating resilience monitoring and evaluation and learning. And I apologize for my voice. I have really bad allergies, and yes, I sound like I'm sick, but I'm not really. So I'll start off by just giving an overview. I'll be focusing on some M&E requirements for the complex programs and how we define complex programs. I will be speaking around some of the activities and some of the challenges that we've experienced with integrating M&E and resilience on these programs, particularly a few programs funded by USAID, a program funded by DFID, as well as some key takeaways from all those programs in terms of what is most effective in integrating resilience, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. First, just a brief definition. Mercy Corps refers to a program. It's the same definition as USAID has for an activity. So it's a set of activities that have a common goal. And for us, a complex program is one that is typically of a larger budget, that has multiple partners, multiple sectors, operates in a complex environment, and tends to have very rigorous monitoring, evaluation, and learning requirements. And in our experience, we've seen both technical and operational successes and challenges with integrating resilience M&E, and I'll speak to both of those. The programs, as I mentioned, I'll be discussing are primarily Food for Peace funded programs in Nepal, the DRC, Uganda, and a program funded by DFID in Mali. Typically what we see on these programs, and the reason we refer to these programs as having more rigorous monitoring, evaluation, and learning requirements, is that they're multi-sectoral. They have a lot of monitoring, evaluation, and research activities that often have competing priorities. They always have a requirement for a very comprehensive theory of change and a log frame. And in addition, the requirements for monitoring, both through baseline and inline surveys as well as routine monitoring, tend to be extensive. We're talking about 25 to 140 indicators for some of our programs. And in addition to that, they have a beneficiary tracking component. We are either tracking households, for example, on Apollo in Uganda, we have to track 300,000 households through a case management process where we're tracking each activity. And on other programs, we're tracking about 550 households on an annual basis. And we often also have multiple monitoring, evaluation, and learning partners that we want to make sure that we're coordinating with and contributing to the learning for the program so that we can best adapt. Some key factors for integration of resilience, particularly for our program in the DRC and our program in Uganda. What was integral to the success of these programs was the stress process. And for those of you that are not familiar, the stress is a resilience assessment. And the process has been defined very well by Mercy Corps. And if you need additional information, there's quite a bit of information on it. And what do I mean by participatory? Program team members that were available during the implementation of the stress participated in either conducting key informant interviews or focus group discussions, in thinking about the process, and also in disseminating some of the stress findings. And the reason this was critical because it created buy-in for addressing the shocks and stresses that were identified in the stress, as well as it created an opportunity to think about what capacity the team wanted to build as a result of these stress findings. And that's really important because one of the challenges I'll discuss a bit later is kind of the disconnect between an assessment that's sometimes done by the technical team, and then the monitoring and evaluation that's done by the M&E team, and making sure that those are connected. After the stress was conducted, the team worked on mapping capacity outcomes. So what were the outcomes they wanted to see as a result of their work in addressing those stress and shocks that were identified in the regions? And those outcomes, some were already mapped out in the existing theory of change or log frame, others had to be added. But it was an exercise that the team had to participate on and think through and identify any gaps, as Jill has mentioned previously. The next step will be simplifying, for those of you that are familiar with Food for Peace programs, the theory of change is quite comprehensive, and it includes assumptions, and it includes outcomes that may be outside of the program scope, really making that theory of change more digestible, and that's where the results change process comes in. Some of our teams are calling results frameworks, not to be confused with the results frameworks that USAID has, but it is that process of clearly mapping out how your activities contribute to this resilience outcomes and how they contribute to the overall program goal. And once those are identified, thinking about which indicators are we already collecting, particularly when APOLU, for example, is collecting 146 data for 146 indicators. Which indicators are we collecting that are already measuring some of those resilience outcomes and some outputs? Which additional indicators should we need or may we need? And should we also be conducting post-shock and stress monitoring? In addition to that, on APOLU, we're also embedding a resilience module that was developed by Tango in both the baseline and endline survey. The challenges associated with integrating and implementing all of these activities that I just described start at the design phase. We're often very ambitious with our design, and often the budget doesn't match that ambition. And what we're finding is that making space to take the time to discuss the theory of change with all stakeholders, build the results chain, make sure that the stress findings are disseminated, takes time, it takes budget, it takes adequate staffing. And often that's where we see a lot of the challenges. In addition to that, during startup, particularly during the first 6 months, there is a lot of competing priorities for teams around staffing, around donor deliverables, around requirements. And unfortunately, not everyone is able to participate in these critical activities. And often, as I have already mentioned, there's a disconnect. The monitoring and evaluation team is working on the M&E plan, and the technical team is working on the work plan. Hopefully, they talk to each other on a regular basis, but it's not as purposeful as it would be ideal to really integrate resilience and to really think through a cohesive approach. Finally, planning for learning. Now, what do I mean by that? Actually purposefully budgeting for time to sit together, review the data that was collected, review assessment findings, review any other research or any other evaluation work that has been done on the program, and talk about how do these findings impact their implementation. We often do it haphazardly, but actually planning for that and doing it purposefully is a challenge that we've seen. Some concrete examples on the two projects I just mentioned are from APOLU. So these are some of the indicators. So once the team conducted the stress, identified the capacities they wanted to build, they came up with some existing indicators that would contribute to resilience measurement. And they're highlighted here. We're going to share this presentation. I won't go into detail and describe them. And you will notice that our program, FSP in the DRC, did the same thing. First, they identified the shocks and stresses, primarily around soil degradation, waterborne diseases, and you'll notice that they also came up with indicators to make sure that they're building capacity that address those shocks and stresses for the program during the 5-year duration. The last example is a bit different because it is funded by DFID, and part of the DFID approach, which I know FSP is also starting to implement, is a refine and implement phase. So during the 6 months, the team was able to conduct a short resilience assessment. They were able to share their findings with key stakeholders, and based on that, they actually adapted their activities and had to think about how they integrate resilience to climate shocks. So this was about 4.5, 5 years ago. We were not as far along as we are now in terms of resilience monitoring. So that we actually built our own index and piloted it during the 6 months. And you'll see that the index is a socioeconomic index. It's comprised of nothing that's too surprising to any of us: capacities, access to basic services, assets, and food securities. We found that it was really critical to include partners that had experience. So we included Mercy Corps for the resilience assessment, and we included University of South Carolina for support on post-shock and stress monitoring, as well as for the baseline and endline support. So as you'll see, there's different approaches, particularly for larger programs. You can take the existing theory of change, build a simpler results chain, think about any gaps, and add additional indicators. Or, as Brace chose to do, if those indicators don't exist, think about how you want to measure resilience. And in this case, they actually decided to create their own index score. So time for a quick poll. I'm curious, one of the challenges I mentioned is sometimes the disconnect between the monitoring and evaluation learning team and the technical team. And just a question for all of you is, on the programs that you're familiar with, do M&E and technical staff develop their resilience approach and measurement framework jointly, or is this something that's great? Well, thank you, everyone who responded. It looks like it's a process that sometimes takes place, which is our experience as well, and which I have to say is unfortunate based on our experience, particularly because once that disconnect exists, we did a lessons learned session on one program where the technical team was adamant about the outcomes they achieved both in the health sector and in the WASH sector. And they were listing all these outcomes, and when we reminded them of the indicator plan and the actual indicators that we're collecting, none of those outcomes were reflected. And that was in year 4.5 of the program. The program ended after 5 years. So it's really important that these activities, which most of us know are best practices, are incorporated from the design phase to the end of program transition to ensure that we're constantly measuring what we're implementing and that the technical team is aware of what those results are and how they may need to adapt their activities. I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you for everyone who participated. And I will briefly focus on our next example. I mentioned I will be talking about both the technical challenges, which I've addressed in terms of thinking through how to incorporate the resilience findings, how to incorporate the budget for M&E, and so on. That also touches on operations. And also a key barrier has been team structure. We've seen that on our PAHAL program in Nepal, but we've also seen it on other programs, not just at Mercy Corps, but other organizations as well. Particularly where a program has multi-sectors that they're working in, and there's teams leading those sectors, the work planning tends to be very siloed. And because resilience tends to be a cross-cutting approach, getting teams to actually think about an integrated work plan and how they can contribute to resilience outcomes jointly is more challenging due to obviously making the time to do joint work planning, but also because it is a specific skill set, and also because there's sometimes support from senior management and other times not as much support as there could be from senior management. Often also donors have different approval processes for candidates, so staffing can also be an issue. We've worked on programs where, it takes a year or two to fill a position. And so that particular team is lacking the leadership, which is also not conducive to a joint work planning process. And that has been the experience on Nepal. To address that, what the Nepal program team decided to do is rather than hire managers by sectors, they looked more at the ecosystem. So for example, they wanted to address watershed issues in a region. They hired managers to address more of those ecosystem issues to automatically enforce joint work planning and thinking about outcomes from more a multi-sector perspective versus siloing those sectors. There was a lot of training on joint work planning. Senior managers led those exercises, involved everyone, and they also brought in a very experienced M&E manager who could also facilitate with some of those processes. So we noticed just as important as the actual technical work is in terms of conducting the resilience assessment, thinking about the measurement framework, just as important as that is the team structure and the budget aspect. If you don't have both, particularly on these larger programs, it's really hard to get a lot of traction and to embed resilience measurement as part of your regular monitoring practices. Some key takeaways that I will leave you all with based on our lessons learned and lessons learned from other organizations. These, again, have to do both with technical operations and management, but the number one key takeaway for us has been really having the management support for an integrated team, but also for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and resilience. Really ensuring that management views this as something that is valuable, that's something that the team should prioritize. Second, I saw a question about when should results chains be developed that we'll address a bit later, but the resilience approach, just like monitoring, evaluation, and learning, should be embedded in all phases of the program cycle. yes, ideally it should start at the design. It should be refined at startup. It should be even further refined throughout implementation. With that being said, we need to keep in mind the budget and the staffing requirements to continuing to refine this approach. Somebody has to do it, somebody has to lead it, somebody has to analyze the data, somebody has to do the dissemination, which feeds into the next point of adequate budget and staffing for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Again, a key lesson learned is use the refine and implement phase. Think about what are key questions you want to answer that you were not able to answer during the proposal process. Think about data you can collect that can strengthen your activities and your knowledge about the context. Really think about all the assessments, including the stress or another resilience assessment that your organization may do, and how you can implement that and use those findings to refine your M&E plan once the program starts up. Involve stakeholders, and by that not just external stakeholders, but also internal stakeholders, making sure that the M&E team and the technical team work together. Build digestible results frameworks or results chains. Make sure that the team understands what their activities are contributing to, how they're building resilience. Make sure it's not too theoretical. We've noticed that on a couple of programs when it becomes too theoretical, teams stop paying attention to those tools, and we want to make sure that they're the ones that are driving the revisions of those tools and therefore understanding them. Don't reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of indicators. Let's think about which ones we can already use to measure resilience outcomes. Let's think about if we really need others. Is there secondary data you can use that can measure some of the outcomes that you've identified? And finally, purposeful learning and budgeting for that, whether that's a quarterly review of your data, whether that's an annual reflection session where you're disseminating evaluation findings, talking about the results of an annual survey. Plan for those, budget for those, and think about the most effective way to use those different learning activities. And that is it from my end. So I'll hand it over to Brad, who will be guiding us through the